The train clattered through the American plains with a rhythm that mocked the silence of the men inside. Faces pressed against barred windows caught glimpses of a world they had only known from propaganda posters. Rolling fields, barns painted red, skies so wide they seemed to erase memory itself. These were German prisoners of war, soldiers who had once marched under banners promising world domination, now reduced to cargo crossing a continent that had beaten them. Their uniforms were tattered, their boots worn thin from years of fighting, yet the scent that drifted in through the cracks of the wooden cars was not of smoke or ruin, but of hay, fresh soil, and something almost alien, abundance. When the doors slid open at last, they stepped down not into darkness or dungeons, but into air so clean it startled the lungs. Iowa cornfields stretched beyond the fences, stalks swaying like sentinels of plenty. The camp itself was ordinary, rows of barracks, barbed wire sparkling under the sun, but nothing about it resembled the brutal gulags whispered about in German barracks before surrender. Here the guards carried rifles slung loosely on their shoulders, their postures relaxed, their expressions almost casual. One even nodded politely as he herded the prisoners forward, as though welcoming guests to a strange new farm. Inside the mess hall, long tables groaned under trays of food that to the Germans seemed impossible. White bread so soft it could collapse under a fingertip. Meat cut into thick, steaming slices. Cups of milk so full they spilled with the slightest shake. A silence fell among the men, not out of fear but disbelief. They had last eaten meals like this before the war consumed everything. A corporal with sunken cheeks muttered, "Prisoners of calories," and laughter erupted, startling, even to themselves. It was the kind of laughter that comes from exhaustion, from the absurdity of living long enough to taste plenty again. Life inside the wire quickly became a paradox. There was strict order, yes, roll calls, curfews, the constant presence of guards, but also strange freedoms. The prisoners were given tools to build furniture for their barracks, allowed to organize soccer games on the dusty yards, even permitted radios that hummed with American swing music. The camp sounded less like war, and more like a village clinging to fragments of normalcy. For men who had watched their cities flattened into rubble, it was as if captivity had been confused with resurrection. Work details took them beyond the fences, onto the farms that had been crying out for labor since so many American men had gone to war. Under the blazing summer sun, they stooped beside rows of soybeans, their sweat mixing with that of the farmers who owned the land. There were no shouted curses, no whips cracking, only the occasional offer of water from a jug, sometimes a wink or a half-smile. To the farmers, these men were less enemies than tools to keep the harvest alive. And to the Germans, each day of work was a step into a land that felt almost mythic in its gentleness. But nothing struck them harder than the women. It happened gradually, almost by accident. A glimpse of a nurse passing through the camp gates with a satchel of bandages, the flash of a WC driver maneuvering a jeep across the dusty road. These women carried themselves with a confidence that unsettled and fascinated the prisoners. In Germany, the ideal woman had been painted as silent, dutiful, bound to hearth and motherhood. Here, they saw women who spoke boldly, who laughed loudly, who walked with purpose as though the war itself bent around them. They wore trousers, uniforms, caps tilted just so, and yet they seemed no less graceful for it. One young lieutenant, barely 24, could not look away when a nurse leaned over a wounded prisoner's cot, her face lit with concentration, her hands steady as she cleaned a gash on his arm. Later, he scribbled in a diary the censors would never allow home. She was not beautiful only in her face, but in her freedom. She spoke to us as though we were men, not defeated things. Others whispered similar sentiments at night, lying on bunks as moths danced near lantern light. It was not desire alone that unsettled them. It was the realization that an entire world existed where women were not shadows but equals, where even the enemy's tenderness could feel more human than their homeland's authority. The contradictions gnawed at them. By day, they labored under the sun, watched carefully but rarely humiliated. By night, they lay awake, the smell of bread still clinging to their hands, their stomachs full in a way that felt treacherous. They wrote letters begging families to hold on, though they feared those families starved even as they described their own meals. Some clenched their fists in shame, muttering that they should not grow soft, that Germany still demanded loyalty. Yet others, silently, felt something shifting inside them, an understanding that perhaps the Reich had sold them lies, and that the faces glimpsed here across the barbed wire were glimpses of a different kind of victory. The camp began to breathe with strange rhythms. Soccer balls bounced against fences. Accordions played tunes half forgotten. Guards strolled without tension. And still, the women appeared in fleeting moments, delivering supplies, tending wounds, driving trucks past the fences. Each sighting carried weight, as though the very image of a confident woman in uniform was a spark lighting dry tinder in the prisoners' hearts. It was not romance in the ordinary sense. It was recognition of another way of being, of lives unbroken by chains of ideology. And so the paradox deepened. They were prisoners, yet freer than they had been in years. They were enemies, yet treated with a civility that felt like mercy. They were men raised to believe women should be silent, yet haunted by the voices of women who spoke like thunder. The barbed wire was real, sharp enough to cut flesh, but beyond it stretched horizons that seemed to whisper of a different world, one that could not be unseen once glimpsed. At night, when the lanterns flickered low and the fields grew silent, many lay awake with the same thought. Home was waiting, or rather, ruins were waiting. And already, in the quiet rustle of uniforms and the sound of laughter drifting from beyond the fence, they knew the choice that would one day come: return to the ashes of their homeland, or reach for the forbidden dream they had discovered here. The thought was dangerous, unspoken, but impossible to silence. And it was only the beginning. The days rolled into weeks, and the prisoners learned the rhythms of their strange captivity. Each morning the whistle blew, the gates creaked open, and work details marched toward fields or factories, their shadows stretching long in the prairie dawn. Yet what began as duty slowly turned into something more elusive. The sensation of belonging to a life that was not meant for them, a life that shimmered just beyond reach. The fields smelled of cut hay and warm soil, the air so different from the acrid smoke of bombed-out Germany that it felt almost intoxicating. It was not freedom, not truly, but it was close enough to taste, and that taste burned in their throats. Among the prisoners was Karl, a former schoolteacher turned reluctant soldier. His hands had carried chalk before they carried a rifle, and now they carried fence posts on an Iowa farm. He moved with quiet discipline, head bent, shoulders sloped, but inside his chest something stubborn refused to die. He noticed details others ignored: the generosity of the farmers who sometimes left a jug of cold water in the shade, the way the cicadas buzzed so loudly it drowned out thoughts of home. And most of all, he noticed the women. The first time he saw her, she was stepping out of a jeep parked beside the fence line. A WAC driver, no older than 25, her cap tilted at an angle that suggested both order and defiance. She spoke to the guards with casual authority, her voice carrying across the yard, firm yet melodic. Karl could not hear her words, only their cadence, but that was enough. He felt something stir in him, admiration, envy, maybe even longing. She glanced at the prisoners briefly, her eyes steady, unafraid, as though she were gazing not at enemies, but at men stripped of illusions. That look, fleeting as it was, settled into Karl's mind like an ember refusing to go out. The others felt it too. Whispers spread through the barracks at night. Some spoke of nurses who bandaged their wounds with gentle hands. Others of secret notes slipped into calloused palms by farmers' daughters bold enough to flirt. One prisoner confessed in a hushed tone that he had dreamt of marrying an American girl, though he could not even remember the curve of her face. The barracks erupted in laughter at the absurdity, but the laughter masked something else, a hunger no bread or meat could satisfy. For men raised in a society where women were bound by strict roles, the discovery was revolutionary. These women walked with purpose, drove trucks, issued orders, and yet remained unmistakably feminine. They represented a freedom the prisoners had never imagined, a freedom that mocked the rigid doctrines drilled into them. Every glimpse across the barbed wire became a lesson more powerful than any speech, more subversive than any propaganda leaflet dropped from the sky. Not everyone welcomed this awakening. Hans, a staunch believer in the fatherland even in defeat, spat whenever the subject arose. "They are witches," he snarled one evening, his voice trembling with bitterness. "They dress like men, speak like men, and the Americans make fools of us by letting us admire them." Yet even Hans, when he thought no one was looking, was caught stealing glances toward the nurses as they walked past the infirmary. The contradiction was too powerful to resist. The guards noticed the change. They saw the way the men's postures softened, the way conversations drifted into unfamiliar territory. There were warnings against fraternization, strict punishments for anyone who dared cross the line. But punishment could not erase imagination. A smile glimpsed through a fence was enough to ignite a week of whispered stories. A shared laugh with a farmer's daughter over spilled milk became the spark for a dozen daydreams. These men were captives, yet their hearts wandered freely, roaming into futures they had no right to claim. Letters home became painful exercises. How could they describe what they felt without betraying themselves? How could they write of soft bread, of laughter, of the haunting beauty of women in uniform, while their families starved among ruins? Carl tried once, drafting a letter to his mother. He wrote of kindness, of fields of corn that swayed like oceans, of a nurse whose face lingered in his mind. But as he reached the end, shame flooded him. He tore the letter into scraps and fed it to the stove. What comfort was there in confessing that captivity felt sweeter than freedom? The temptation grew heavier as rumors of war's end spread. Germany was collapsing, cities reduced to ash. The men knew that return meant hunger, rubble, and grief. Here, inside the barbed wire, life pulsed with warmth. The irony was bitter. Prisoners who dreaded release, soldiers who feared the gates might one day open. Each passing glimpse of an American woman only deepened the conflict, for she became the living emblem of what they could never truly possess. Not her hand, not her life, but the liberty she carried with every step. Carl found himself staring at the horizon one evening, the sun melting into orange and violet streaks across the sky. Beyond the fence, the WAC driver climbed into her Jeep again, her silhouette framed against the fading light. For a moment, she turned her head, and though he could not be sure, Carl believed her eyes met his. It lasted a heartbeat, no more. But it was enough. That single glance pressed against the fault line within him, widening the crack between loyalty to the world he had left and longing for the one that beckoned before him. As night settled over the camp, the men lay restless on their bunks, each lost in thoughts they could not share aloud. The cicadas droned, the guards paced, the barbed wire gleamed under moonlight. Freedom was near enough to taste, yet always on the other side. And deep inside, a question they dared not voice throbbed louder with each day. When the war ended and the ships lined up to carry them home, would they even want to go? By the summer of 1945, the camp gates no longer felt like cages but thresholds, holding back a storm that waded across the ocean. Germany had surrendered, its cities reduced to skeletons of stone and smoke, its people wandering through streets littered with rubble. News filtered into the American camps in fragments, letters smudged with grief, Red Cross bulletins that spoke of shortages, whispers carried by newly arrived prisoners. For the men who had once dreamed of return, the idea of home now tasted like ash. Yet the orders came all the same. The prisoners were to be repatriated. The ships were waiting at the docks. The announcement fell on the camp like a sudden frost. Men who had grown used to the rhythm of work details and the comfort of bread served hot from American kitchens now sat in silence, staring at the ground as though the earth itself might save them. Carl heard the words from a guard whose tone was almost apologetic. "You'll be going home soon." Home. The word cracked like a whip. He thought of his mother's last letter, the ink blurred where tears had smudged the page. She wrote of nights spent in a basement, of neighbors gone missing, of hunger so sharp it made her dizzy. She begged him to come back, yet he could see between the lines. There would be nothing waiting but ruins. At night, the barracks hummed with unease. Some tried to sound hopeful, muttering about rebuilding, about duty, about honor. Others confessed dread, admitting what no soldier should, that America, even through barbed wire, had felt more like life than the homeland they had fought to defend. Carl lay awake, staring at the rafters, remembering the WAC driver's eyes, the curve of her mouth set in determination. That fleeting glance haunted him more than any battlefield memory. It was not love exactly, but revelation. She had come to embody the freedom he could never carry with him. A reminder that beyond the ships lay not only destruction, but the death of possibility. The journey to the docks was like a funeral procession. The prisoners boarded trucks, their meager belongings in sacks slung over shoulders, and rolled past the same fields where they had once bent under the sun, past farmers who tipped their hats in farewell, past barns that smelled of hay and memory. Some prisoners waved weakly. Others turned their faces away, unable to bear the sight of the land they were leaving behind. Carl sat pressed against the wooden side of the truck, his fists clenched, his heart pounding as if it might leap out and bury itself in the soil. At the docks, the air smelled of salt and iron. The ships loomed massive, their hulls black against the gray sky, their decks lined with sailors barking orders. Gangplanks stretched down like bridges to another world. The prisoners stood in ranks, silent except for the shuffle of boots on stone. Guards called names, ticking them off lists, herding them forward one by one. Each step felt irreversible, a surrender to a fate none of them wanted. Some resisted openly. One man clutched his chest, collapsing in a theatrical spasm, insisting he was too ill to travel. Another claimed to have broken his foot, limping dramatically until a guard prodded him up the plank with the butt of a rifle. A few simply refused to move, their faces pale but defiant. "I won't go," one muttered, his voice trembling more with despair than courage. They were dragged forward all the same, their protests drowned by the groan of engines warming for departure. But beneath the spectacle of resistance lay quieter rebellions. Men scribbled desperate notes, slipping them into the hands of sympathetic guards or tossing them onto the docks in the hope that someone, anyone, might read their pleas. Others whispered bargains to farmers who had come to watch, begging for work, for shelter, for the chance to remain in the land that had unknowingly healed them. Few offers were possible. The law was the law. They were prisoners, and prisoners went home, even if home was no longer a place that deserved the name. Carl's turn came at last. He felt the gangplank shudder beneath his boots, the sea air sharp against his skin. The ship loomed above, its iron belly ready to swallow him. He paused, just for a heartbeat, his eyes sweeping the dockside crowd. Among the figures stood a group of nurses, their white uniforms bright against the gloom, their faces unreadable. For a moment, one of them lifted her gaze, and he thought, perhaps foolishly, that she was the same WAC driver he had seen months before. The recognition struck like a blade. He gripped the railing, torn between duty and a longing that had no name, a longing that had grown louder with every mile away from the fields of Iowa. The engines roared, drowning thought. He moved forward, swallowed by the ship's shadow. Around him, men murmured prayers, curses, half-finished confessions. The decks filled with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, each man staring back at the receding land as though trying to brand it onto memory. Carl kept his eyes fixed on the dock until it blurred, until the uniforms of the women dissolved into the haze, until the horizon began to swallow everything he wanted. As the ship groaned into motion, the truth settled over him with a weight heavier than chains. They were not sailing toward home. They were sailing toward a graveyard of cities, toward hunger and grief, toward ghosts that would not let them rest. Behind them, the land they had left shimmered like a mirage, full of abundance, of mercy, of faces that had taught them a different kind of strength. And though the ocean stretched before them, endless and unforgiving, the thought whispered through the ranks like a curse, like a prayer. Some part of them would never leave America. Carl closed his eyes as the wind lashed salt against his cheeks, the memory of a steady gaze burning still. In that silence between heartbeats, he understood what the barbed wire had concealed all along. Not captivity, but the most dangerous temptation of all. And the moment the coastline disappeared, he knew the conflict was far from over. The war was over, but its shadows lingered in every ruined street of Germany. Men returned to find mothers aged beyond recognition, fathers lost in the rubble, childhood homes reduced to piles of stone. For many former prisoners of war, the repatriation felt like exile, a return not to homeland but to devastation. And yet, as ships unloaded them onto shattered docks, the memory of America clung stubbornly, like a fragrance that would not wash away. Among them was Carl, who stepped onto German soil with a hollow ache in his chest, carrying nothing but a duffel bag, a few letters, and the unshakable image of a woman's steady gaze through a fence. The days that followed were consumed with survival. Food lines stretched endlessly, ration cards bought little more than scraps, and the winter of 1946 carved its hunger into every cheekbone. Carl tried to resume his old life, teaching arithmetic to children who shivered in classrooms without windows, their pencils scratching against scraps of paper salvaged from bomb sites. He spoke softly, determined to restore some semblance of normalcy, but inside he felt like an actor performing lines from a forgotten play. His body was home, but his spirit remained across the ocean, wandering the Iowa fields where he had labored as a prisoner yet lived like a man. Others felt the same. Letters arrived from fellow prisoners scattered across Germany, confessions written in cautious ink. They spoke of wives who no longer recognized them, of nights haunted by the taste of bread they could not find, of women in white uniforms who had taught them, without words, that life could be something gentler. Some dared to write of America as if it were a lover, a land that had held them briefly and then cast them back, leaving them lovesick for its abundance and its freedom. Opportunities began to trickle in. Rumors spread that America was opening its doors to workers, to immigrants who could help rebuild what had been broken worldwide. Some of the former prisoners seized this chance. They filed petitions, gathered recommendations from American farmers who remembered them as diligent and respectful, and waded through bureaucratic storms that tested every ounce of patience. A few succeeded. They returned not as prisoners, but as free men, greeted not by guards with rifles, but by employers with handshakes. For them, the dream became real. Marriages to women they had once only admired from across barbed wire, children born with American names, farms tilled not as laborers but as owners. Carl wrestled with his decision. Each morning he walked past lines of widows begging for bread, past blackened shells of buildings where children scavenged bricks. Each evening he returned to his tiny apartment, where silence pressed in like another wall. The memory of that fleeting glance, the WC driver's eyes lifted against the dusk, remained sharper than the reality before him. He knew he was in danger of clinging to a ghost, of idealizing a world he had touched only in fragments. And yet he could not deny that those fragments had changed him, that they had revealed a truth about dignity, about mercy, about freedom that Germany had buried long before its collapse. One winter night, as snow drifted against broken windows, Carl unfolded a letter from an old camp comrade who had resettled in Wisconsin. The words burned with quiet hope. "I married the nurse I once told you about. She is stronger than any soldier I ever knew. We have a farm now. It is hard work, but the soil here does not know war." Carl read the lines again and again, his hands trembling. The choice lay before him, not in abstract, but in ink on the page. He could remain in Germany, bound by ruins, or he could chase the vision that had sustained him. A vision embodied not by a single woman, but by an entire way of life. When he finally left, the journey felt less like escape than pilgrimage. The docks were crowded with men and women clutching suitcases, their faces etched with the same mixture of fear and longing. Carl boarded a ship bound westward, his heart heavy yet alive with possibility. As the German coast faded behind him, he did not look back. His eyes fixed on the horizon, where he imagined fields stretching endless and women walking unafraid, carrying in their stride the promise of a different future. In America, Carl was not alone. Thousands of former POWs returned, weaving themselves into the fabric of the nation they had once been taught to hate. Some became farmers, others carpenters, others teachers again. They carried scars, yes, but also gratitude, an enduring astonishment that their captors had shown them more humanity than their leaders ever had. They built lives that stood as quiet rebukes to the past, proof that enemies could become neighbors, that even the defeated could find redemption in new soil. And yet the heart of the story was never simply about survival or work. It was about faces, faces that lingered, that reshaped destinies. The nurse bending over a wounded arm, the driver stepping from her jeep with dust on her boots, the secretary laughing boldly in a crowded office. These were not just women. They were symbols, living proof that freedom could be graceful, commanding, unashamed. For men who had been chained to ideology, those faces had been revelations, opening doors that could never again be closed. Carl carried them with him as he stepped into his new life, their memory guiding every choice. In the rustle of wheat in the fields, he heard echoes of laughter beyond the wire. In the warmth of bread pulled from an oven, he felt again the shock of abundance. And in the eyes of the woman he would one day marry, he saw the reflection of that first glance, steady and unafraid, reminding him that the past need not define the future. The story did not end with ships or borders, nor with battles won or lost. It ended in transformation, in men who once raised their arms in salute now raising their children in peace, in prisoners who discovered that captivity could hold the seed of freedom, in faces that refused to fade from memory. And as Carl stood one evening beneath a sky vast and unbroken, the prairie wind rushing over him, he realized that the true victory had never been written in maps or treaties. It was written in the hearts of men who, against all odds, had chosen not to return to the ashes, but to stay with the faces that had shown them a different way to live. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.